In this podcast, I'll say this is probably one of the most important things we'll talk about for coaches and coaching specifically and cultivating a gym environment, which is
Mhm.
more important than the epistemological approaches, right? Like the methods you're using to get students to learn. I think more important than that is the culture, the environment, because the culture precedes the learning, right?
Mhm.
So if you could have all the tools at your disposal, you could understand constraints-led approach like the back of your hand. You could understand how humans learn, cognitive behavior, all these things. But if you don't have the environment that's conducive to these learning methodologies, your students are not going to get out of it what you want them to get out of it. So more important and the most important thing a coach can do is focus on the environment first. What kind of facility, what kind of academy do you want to have? And then from there, figure out your theory of knowledge. Don't start with the theory of knowledge and then build the culture around that,
Mhm.
because sometimes those two things are contradictory.
Nick, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you for having me, Adolfo. Really appreciate this, and I'm excited to talk jiu-jitsu. That's what I do for a living. So let's dive right in.
I'm stoked. I have a million questions. So, you are Nick Salles, a black belt under Michael Musumeci,
Yes, sir.
and you are the co-owner, I believe, of the Movement Art Academy gym in Pennsylvania, correct?
Yeah, and I think this past October was the 5th year we've been open, which doesn't maybe sound like a whole lot of time, but I kid you not, it literally feels like 5 months. Like it went by so fast. We opened during COVID out of necessity. It was just one of those things that an opportunity came up and we couldn't turn it down. So we took it. And that was rough, man, because as you know, there's, a little bit of a stigma if you were training and stuff. And I completely understand. But it was one of those things that we had to do at the time. And so opening up a gym when people were kind of on the fence about physical activity, like I said, completely understanding, but we managed to push through. It wasn't until like I think a couple months in that we hit, that green zone where you can finally take a deep breath and relax.
Wow.
Like bills are taken care of. We're making a little bit of money, so
A couple months. Wow, that's pretty
couple months,
fast.
yeah. Well, so
Wow.
what I say is you'd be surprised, like in a time like that, how excited people are just to get out there and interact and socialize. We're talking like this was in I want to say like towards November. So if the lockdown happened in March, like people are just itching to get back out
Itching.
there,
Yeah.
especially people who've been training before COVID. They've gone all this time without training, so they were just excited to get back out there. We were surprised, of course, but we didn't turn anyone away. We accepted everybody. We trained, and yeah, it was a really scary time because we had no idea what to expect. It was literally every single dollar in our bank account, and that all went into moving our, like we say, like we literally burned the life rafts. There was no, like it was either we were gonna make this happen or I was gonna go back to square one and figure out what I was going to do with my life. But luckily, everything worked out. 5 years later, we're here. Movement Art is thriving, and I couldn't be happier.
It's amazing how many of you guys I talked to that did that, right? They opened an academy during that time out of dumb luck or dumb bad luck, depending on your perspective, right? And like you said, afterwards, not knowing, I mean, if you could ride out that year or whatever it was for your amount of time that you're paying that lease and killing yourself there to some extent financially, you could be potentially in good shape because of the burning desire of everyone to want to not only like train again, but like just to get together, the community of a gym.
Exactly, especially like considering how we were situated at the time. So I was an assistant instructor at Marcelo Garcia's academy in Manhattan. And so Manhattan got hit the hardest. Like right away, Marcelo sent the announcement out. They were going to close the gym. And we, like everyone who was working there, we were just like in this limbo. We didn't know what was going to happen. We knew New York was probably going to be one of the last cities to open up. So everyone was starting to make plans like, what are we going to do? Word got around that some people were moving to other states. I know Marcelo himself moved to Hawaii. A couple of interactions I had with him regarding the gym, when he planned to reopen, if he was consider reopening, he had no idea. And so this was around like summertime, so a good amount of time after the lockdown. And so that was my income. That was what I was doing full time at the time. So, and Danny was in a similar boat where he was teaching at NPR, which is a gym in Pennsylvania.
Right. That's Daniel Maira.
Daniel Maira, my co-partner at Movement Art, he was teaching and training at this gym, also training at Marcelo Garcia's academy. And we were, I mean, I can say this now, right? Because it's after the fact, but we were both living in the closet at that gym. And now we're in a situation where Danny is now not working there. So we're not allowed to even live in the closet, right? And so I didn't, I was out of a job. We didn't have a place to sleep at the time. Of course, we can go back and crash with our parents, but we just wanted to keep going. We didn't want to accept the situation and just lay down and wait for something to happen. So for us, we were lucky. There was a gym in PA in Richboro that was selling the gym as a result of COVID. They were trying to keep the lights on, but I guess tuition wasn't paying for the rent. So they just wanted to close down. And luckily, we had just enough money to purchase the gym. And so when the opportunity came up and they were selling the gym, we took it. And like I said, we had no idea what was going to happen after the fact. But I'll tell you this, our mentality was pretty solid. I think we had a solid plan because in our minds, we were like, oh, worst case scenario, we have a place to train because we were still very focused on, compete. And this was at brown belt, mind you. So we were opening the gym as brown belts. We wanted to compete at the world class level at brown belt. We wanted to win worlds. And of course at black belt. So we were like, let's just get this place and we'll just train at the very least. Even if we don't have any, we can just train all day. We'll have mats. And, little did we know people would be joining us and we would be able to create a living for ourselves out of that situation. But yeah, just kind of went into it blind. So.
Yeah, amazing. And I've heard about you talking about, you got your bio degree. You're not really a business economics guy initially coming out of the gate. So a lot of this was learning on the fly. And yeah, I was so curious how you and Danny just even approached the whole thing. So thank you for that story. I came on my information about you, seeing you in BJJ Fanatics clips and YouTube videos and stuff like that, and your content, which is fantastic, by the way. For those of you who don't know, I would highly recommend you check out Nick's instructionals and everything too. It's like fantastic perspective, and I like your philosophy and culture of the gym, which hopefully we can get into. One of the things, a lot of it early on, or maybe not so early on, was this Bolo Bros persona, right? Which was great marketing, by the way, and a great way to angle it. But what I'm curious about, people will associate you with perhaps that, right? That type of technique, that type of mindset. I'm curious more about your personal game as well. And what are other aspects of your game that people perhaps aren't aware of that you enjoy playing?
Yeah. So honestly, there's a rumor that kind of like lives around me and Danny whenever people come and visit. Even our students will ascertain this. It's that when we're rolling and you train with us, yeah, we'll bully you, but that's not the meat and potatoes of our game, right? Like I love to pass guard. I try to stay on top most of the training session if I'm sparring with the students. I try to work on my passing as much as possible. Danny's a really good wrestler. He's always working on his wrestling. So we are multi-dimensional, right? Like there are other aspects of the game that we enjoy, probably even more so than the berimbolo itself. However, coming from where, we were cultivating our jiu-jitsu, which is like on our own, and also like being at Marcelo's where there wasn't a whole lot of access to the berimbolo, I think it created this vacuum where it's like, well, if we're going to be our own coach, which is literally, as we start talking about movement art, is the literal premise of our gym, like how to be your own coach, how to create your own knowledge. So we were following and living by that philosophy very early on. So when there was this vacuum at Marcelo's, they weren't teaching the berimbolo. They weren't teaching these other things that I saw as a meta in the featherweight division, in the lightweight division. We took it upon ourselves to teach ourselves those things. So far entrenched in that, where we almost embodied the persona of the thing that we were trying to embody, right? So like in the road of discovering what it was a berimbolo and how to tie a De La Hiva with the collar sleeve, we found ourselves actually branding ourselves with that. So much so that students would get private lessons with me at Marcelo's regarding that because there was no one else really doing it. I mean, Gianni Grippo was doing it a little bit, but I feel like we really took it upon ourselves to brand ourselves as, like you mentioned, the Bolo Bros. Almost as like, for us, it was like satirical because it was like, of course, you have the Mendez brothers, you have the Meow brothers. Like, who are we to call ourselves the Bolo Bros, right? But we're like, no one's teaching this stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
almost like one of those things that everyone knows it's effective, but it's hush hush, unspoken, like, oh, it's like for the flexible people, or it's like, it doesn't really work unless like you just, like you're one of those people. Like they abstracted the idea of a barren bolo so much that no one could really even wrap their minds around it. So we were like, let's just dive deep into this and let's learn it. Like you said, next thing you know, we're the Bolo Bros. We're hitting it in competitions. Companies like Jiu-Jitsu X or Grappler's Guide, BJJ Fanatics are hitting us up to teach the barren bolo because there wasn't a whole lot of resources and information on it. And so we didn't fight that. We didn't resist it. We just kind of went with that pull. And to this day, I get messages for seminars, and people are like, "Hey, can you teach the barren bolo?"
Wow.
Yeah, I'll teach the barren bolo. If someone asks me like, "What do you want to teach?" I'm gonna want to, teach passing or teach maybe, you know, more conceptually. Like I like to go into seminars and teach skills that people can take with them and apply it to all of their jiu-jitsu, almost like universalized concepts, not so much like a specific position, but I'll teach it. Like you said, it's pretty funny how that happened because it didn't happen like consciously. It was just one of those things that just happened naturally as a consequence of us wanting to do this thing that no one would show us.
I thought it was great. It was
Yeah.
cool. Wow, guest, that was really interesting. But did you know, throughout history, salt has been highly valued and commonly used as currency? Warriors and sailors were sometimes given rations of salt for their wages. If they were worthy, they were said to have earned their salt. Salt Electrolytes drink mix is designed for today's warriors, athletes, and those who get after it and work up a sweat regularly. If you're eating healthy, drinking plenty of water, and working out, you need to replenish your electrolytes. With a light, refreshing flavor, salt is great to drink during your workout because it will not coat your mouth with a thick film. Salt contains 6 different electrolytes, with a touch of iodine to help maintain a healthy thyroid. No sugar, no color, no BS. Go earn your salt. And on top of that, if you use code FWB, how much should we give you off? 5%? 10%? Nah, 15%, just because we're friends. Now go get it. Salt Electrolytes. And one thing I heard about too, and that I'm very interested in, is you and Danny's teaching strategy for the academy. And oftentimes in employment and other academies that we've visited or perhaps, been a part of before, you discover things, it's the reason we leave jobs, right? Sometimes too, is things you don't want in maybe your next job or your next business or your next academy or something you want to make for yourself. Can you talk about that journey and your philosophy and what did you guys want in your teaching strategy?
You kind of touched on it. So first is learning what not to do. And a lot of the things that I look back on and say, yeah, this is something I don't want to replicate in the gym environment are things that I didn't even realize at the time were necessarily like things that I didn't like because I just accepted them as norms, right? Like when I was training at an MMA gym as a blue belt, that's what I thought jiu-jitsu was. So when the coach is saying you got to do it his way or else, like, but why? No, you don't ask questions. For me, these were just norms that I thought were associated with the jiu-jitsu environment. So I didn't really think too much about it until I started teaching. And this was like later on, maybe as a purple belt, brown belt, I really started to think of who I wanted to be as a coach. That I started looking back retrospectively thinking, wow, it didn't have to be this way. The coach created that culture and enforced those norms, but no one says that you have to do it this way. And so when me and Danny were thinking about what we wanted movement art to be, it first started with this project of, all right, let's look back at all of our coaches, all the gyms that we've trained at, and let's pinpoint the things that we didn't like, things that created toxic cultures, things that maybe impede and slow down progress. So first was that process of finding out what don't we want. And then as far as things that we want to do, that's a process that is still ongoing. Like every day I'm learning more as a coach. I'm figuring out different ways to design practices, how to engage the students. Jiu-jitsu itself is always evolving. There's always new things to focus on, right? So in terms of what to do, I would encourage people to always be open-minded to learning more. And the gym environment shouldn't be something static. It should be something that's always evolving with the students and with you as the coach. But as far as what not to do, those are things you can start with, and those are things that won't ever be reintroduced into the environment, right? And so we can start there with like norms that shouldn't exist in the environment, right? And I guess to back it up, I want to just talk about jiu-jitsu right now as a global project, right? Because right now jiu-jitsu is we're at an interesting time where, you know, you do have this tension, right? You have, you know, the ecological approach and people preaching the constraints-led approach, and then you have the traditionalists who want to approach jiu-jitsu the same way it's been approached for decades now. I think what Greg Souders has done for jiu-jitsu has been amazing, right? Which has essentially been to inject new ideas and to get coaches to think about how they're coaching. More important than the methodologies themselves is getting coaches to realize that there's more to coaching than maybe what they previously had thought. So we can talk more about that. But for me, and I guess in this podcast, I'll say this is probably one of the most important things we'll talk about for coaches and coaching specifically and cultivating a gym environment, which is more important than the epistemological approaches, right? Like the methods you're using to get students to learn. I think more important than that is the culture, the environment, because the culture precedes the learning, right?
Hmm.
So if you could have all the tools at your disposal, you could understand constraints-led approach like the back of your hand. You could understand how humans learn, cognitive behavior, all these things. But if you don't have the environment that's conducive to these learning methodologies, your students are not going to get out of it what you want them to get out of it. So more important, and the most important thing a coach can do is focus on the environment first. What kind of facility, what kind of academy do you want to have? And then from there, figure out your theory of knowledge. Don't start with the theory of knowledge and then build the culture around that, because sometimes those two things are contradictory. Okay.
Yeah. What if I'm too afraid to ask a question?
Exactly. And okay, so let's go there, right? What if you're too scared to ask a question? Well, why is that? And so this is something I talked a little bit about, which I got so much backlash for. I think BJJ Eastern Europe posted a whole article and people were like, what is he talking about? Because I was talking about traditions in jiu-jitsu, like having to do 20 burpees if you're late. Mind you, these are students with families and lives. Most of them are professionals in their field. So for me, a jiu-jitsu guy to scold and tell another grown human being to do 20 burpees because they're late, I think is absurd, right? So I was like criticizing a lot of these norms that existed in the traditional martial arts, and I got a lot of backlash for it.
My big one is always like asking permission to use the restroom. If we're two adults, and I'm a middle-aged man, do I need to ask you to go pee?
Yeah.
You know?
Can you imagine? And it's funny, I'll just go on a quick tangent because I'll teach at other gyms, forgetting this, that every gym has their norms, right? Their culture.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I'll be at a seminar teaching, someone's late, and because in my gym, if you're late, just join the class. If there's
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
student who needs a
Same.
partner, you just grab them. If
Yeah.
there's no one available, just join a group, just start learning, just do something, okay? I'm at seminars and there's students like lined up at the edge of the mat just staring
Yeah.
at me. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, that's strange. Like, why are they just staring at me? Like, do they not want to join in? Do they not
Right. Right.
like me? And then the coach or whoever will approach me eventually and be like, oh, are they allowed to? And I'm like, what? Like, they're waiting for me. It's been like 20 minutes. They're just standing there. I'm like, they paid for the seminar and they're waiting for me to give them permission to access the seminar. So it's like, and I have to remind myself all the time that this is the reality in a lot of gyms. So for me, it's mind-boggling, and I'm very vocal about this because I do want the culture to change with the times. And I will say it comes with a caveat, right? Of course, there should be gyms whose goal are to preserve the tradition and people have the freedom to go to those gyms. But I think as jiu-jitsu evolves the way that it's evolving, I think people have to be more mindful of that. At least be conscious of why you're doing those things, right? If you're thinking critically about these norms and these traditions and you're like, nah, I still want to do them, then fine. but just don't do them because your coach did them or you think that's what you're supposed to do. Like, have a philosophy of life, have a theory of gym ownership and how you want to cultivate that environment so that you can at least explain to me why you have those things other than, oh, that's just how things are, right? So I just want gym owners and coaches to think deeper about these things. But yeah, going back to the whole reason we went on this tangent. So traditionally, gyms in jiu-jitsu are very authoritarian, right? They're very top to bottom. You have the central instructor. Maybe underneath that instructor, you have a couple of assistant or part-time instructors. And then the students attend the class and they implement what is usually called in like critical thinking or pedagogy, the banking model, right? Which is they sit down, you treat your students as if they are containers in which we just deposit information into. They're expected to memorize the information we give them. Oftentimes, the information that is being taught is very decontextualized. They're very idealized forms of techniques that maybe the instructor was taught, and they're just trying to pass on the same exact moves that they do onto their students. And for me, this is very authoritarian, right? And of course, like I said, some people don't think about this. They were taught like this in the American education system, right? They just go to a class, they sit there, the teacher talks for 1 hour, they try to memorize everything so they can pass tests, they go home, and that's how we view education, especially in the Western world. And so jiu-jitsu schools are taught like this. But I just hope to raise a little bit more awareness as to why does it have to be like this? And there
Mhm.
are different ways. And so you brought up a very interesting idea. Like, imagine having a school that is more modern in terms of the epistemology of how students are acquiring their knowledge. So you do CLA, you do ecological approach, all this and that, but it's still authoritarian. That doesn't make sense. That's a contradiction. Like you said, can they even ask questions? Are they allowed to use the bathroom without asking you? And so for me, I think it's imperative that coaches who want to stay up to date with their practice designs also consider the culture and the environment of the gym. And so for me, I try to approach it more democratically and seek the students to be more participatory. Like, I want the students to engage and participate in the learning process. And that doesn't mean that I'm not a coach. And
It's pretty awesome that you mentioned that because, sometimes I get asked the question of like, what's your advice to a white belt? And one of the most important things I realized early on is take ownership of your own learning as soon as possible. That your instructor is not the end all be all of your entire jujitsu journey. And a lot of it is upon you to progress as needed to fill whatever it may be. And then also to your point about the places that want you to do 1,000 burpees or to face the wall in order to tie your belt, that kind of stuff. I look at it now a little bit differently, in that I see it now as multiple different products because you'd
yeah,
be amazed. I still meet those people that want to say, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, master. You know what I mean? It's just like they want that kind of almost
yeah,
military type of
yeah.
experience or something like that. Not my thing.
Yeah. But I wonder, do they want that or is that how they're socialized? And so they seek familiarity and
Great
comfort
point.
in a jujitsu gym that resembles the other spaces that maybe they grew up in. So if you have a student who was in the Boy Scouts or Eagle Scouts, you have a student who was in a private school that was very strict, like a Catholic school, like how much of that plays into the psychology of a student who expects a jiu-jitsu gym to be very reminiscent of those spaces that they were socialized in, which is interesting. Like you're saying, we could look at those as separate products. But I guess for me, it's what environment is going to be the most conducive to a student to become knowledgeable in jiu-jitsu. And so I think every gym and every coach has to define that for themselves. Of what is their goal? If their goal is to create people who are obedient and disciplined, they want students to be rigid, then fine. Then create a rigid environment with very strict norms that is very traditionalist. But if you want students who can take ownership, like you mentioned, and create their own knowledge and be able to maybe even pass on these skills that they've acquired themselves throughout the journey, if that's the kind of student you want, then you're gonna need to replicate an environment that's closer to what I'm describing, which is more democratic, which is allow students to really express themselves and engage with the building of knowledge, the co-creation of knowledge, rather than just showing up to class and being a receptacle for information that their coach is giving them. And you said this too. You touched on this. Their coach, if they were to just teach their jujitsu, is just recreating or replicating clones of themselves, right? You're only going to know what your coach has ever learned. But I completely disagree with that model of jujitsu as a product. I think we should be teaching students the skills of learning. And how do you do that? Well, you have to be in an environment that allows them to experiment and be flexible in their learning, right? If they're always confined, how do they explore the space outside of their container? And so we could look at it as different products, but I would just beg the question and have these coaches think about what kind of students they want to create. I can speak for my students. When I finish class and when I'm training, I look around and I see students talking about jujitsu with one another. I see students problem solving, troubleshooting. I see an ecosystem where people are sharing information and experiences. I've gone to gyms where that doesn't happen. I've gone to gyms where as soon as, training's done, everyone packs up their stuff, they hit the showers, which is fine. Like you said, we're in a time in jiu-jitsu where there is going to be different products, but which product is the real jiu-jitsu is what I would say. And what I'm going to say next is what brings that back to full circle. How did I develop my jiu-jitsu? How did I develop my philosophy of jiu-jitsu? Like we said, I had to come up through the ranks in gyms where there was a vacuum that I saw needed to be filled. And in order for me to do that, I had to have access to other people who thought the same way I did, access to open mats, access to the mats after hours, which not everyone has. But basically, the only way I can even teach the things that I know, the only way that I became a bowler bro in the first place is by exploring and figuring out for myself what jujitsu is. And so if I betray that process and I teach my students the exact opposite of what I gave myself, which is telling them to do this, that, and a third, then I'm not really allowing them to experience what I experienced, which was the thing about jiu-jitsu I love the most. So in a way, it's a curse and a blessing to be in gyms where, you're not given the tools to learn and think about jiu-jitsu. And so you have to take accountability and do it yourself. But if we can facilitate an environment that leans towards that in the first place, then we don't have to get to the point where students are getting discouraged or becoming almost nihilistic about their training. A lot of people quit when they feel like they're plateauing, and that's because of these rigid systems that don't allow them to
Great point.
explore and and find out for themselves how they can break through those plateaus.
Push back a little bit, or just playing with you here.
Yeah.
What I love about what I'm hearing from you is it almost at movement art, I'm almost hearing there's a lot of fluidity to everything, right? Which creates a really cool outcome. Whereas in these other places, there's rigidity, which can be perceived as a structure, right? And oftentimes new white belts or new students, they want a roadmap. And you know how nebulous jujitsu can feel at times, whether you're in CLA playing games or something like, what are we doing here? What's the outcome? What is the long-term objective? Where am I heading towards? Versus like something else where, it feels much more structured, like,
Yeah.
or whatever. It just seems like two very interesting perspectives. How do you instill trust into your new students with this idea of how I perceive is much more fluid and open?
I think the first thing is there's always an open line of communication. So from the very first day, a student is going to feel that they're being heard and that at any moment they can have a dialogue with the coach. Right. So as I'm teaching, I'm always posing problems. And I always tell them there's no wrong answer. So, like, what do you think? And if I see a student's not participating, I'll call on them and, like, what would you do?
Hmm.
Right. And they could be a
Hmm.
first day white belt, but I want them to start at least understanding that their very primitive understanding of jiu-jitsu is still information, even if it's not the information that's going to win them black belt world. It's still information that is valuable. And then I want to talk about the dichotomy of structure being the structure of ideas that your coach gives you versus the structure of the practice that will, in that structure itself, give students the skills they need to succeed. So, for example, if an instructor says, "Hey guys, we're going to learn an armbar from close guard," right? A student might see that as structure being given to them through this idea of an armbar, but in reality, they're being told how to do an armbar, right? Via a description. They're not really being taught how to think about the armbar, when the armbar should be used. How does the armbar even emerge in a dynamic interaction you have with them? So, my goal as a coach is to design the practice so these ideas kind of emerge out of the maybe heuristics. Every practice is going to be different, right? So, for example, I'll give you a template, right? Instead of going straight to saying, this is what you're going to do, and you're going to shoot a triangle, say I use spider lasso, I would start with a problem, which is when the person leads with their arms, right? And they're trying to control you with their upper body. How do you suppose we deal with this situation? And so, first, I want to create an understanding that first start with the problem of our opponent leading with the upper body. So the students, even if it's their first day, they're going to gain this understanding of, oh, we don't use lower body guards in this case. Like De La Hiva, single leg X, butterfly guard, these aren't even possibilities in this scenario, in this context, right? In the problem that they're being situated in. So right away, they're learning the skill of, okay, if the person leads with the upper body, I have to address the upper body. Then we can start talking about how do we start doing that, right? We can start
Mhm.
introducing the idea of hooks and frames. Different hooks and frames create different guards, spider lasso, collar, sleeve. So now they're not looking at jiu-jitsu abstractly. They're like, oh, it's just different connections I can make. Some connections stop them from running away. Some connections stop them from coming forward. And so they're actually embodying what jiu-jitsu is versus what some people would consider to be structure, which is just their instructor instructing them what to do. I'm much more interested in getting my students to think about jujitsu in a way where they're creating the knowledge as they're being guided along in the class. So there's still structure, but it's just not structure in the traditional sense, I would say.
Right. All right. I'm going to take you on a hard left turn here, real quick.
Yeah, let's do it.
Give me a non jujitsu fondest childhood memory.
Ooh, you really took a left turn there. Man. Oh, fondest childhood memory. I would say when I was a kid, I always looked forward to the summer because I felt like that was when I had the most freedom. And so every time school was out and summer hit, and I lived on the Jersey Shore, so I lived in a town called Oceanport. And I was maybe, I want to say between the ages of 10 and 12. Both my parents worked. So, me and a bunch of my friends would get on bikes and we would just ride our bikes down to the beach. We would hang out on the beach all day. And that's all we would do for like the 2 months of summer. We would just ride our bikes early in the day, come back at night, and we would get into all types of shenanigans. But I just remember thinking this is what freedom feels like. It's like parents not telling you what to do, you kind of learning what life is about by kind of doing your own thing. You're going to convenience stores, you're getting into trouble, you're trying to talk to girls on the boardwalk. So for me, it was a very like liberating time of the year whenever the summer would hit. And I guess now that I'm thinking about it, look at that transition from the school system where it's like very centrally planned,
Mm,
very dictator like to the summer where now it's like freedom, right? A
freedom.
very stark juxtaposition, yeah, to what the school year felt like. So yeah, I would say that would be a very fond memory. Thank you for forcing me to dig that one up.
Very cool, man. Ooh, another particular question that has been popping in my head lately is in regards to the squid and worm guard, why don't we see that at the highest levels anymore, really? We still see lasso, we still see spider utilized quite a bit. Whatever happened to squid and worm?
I think a couple of things happen, right? First is the popularization of no-gi and more athletes going back and forth between seasons. So I think previously we saw the idea of a gi jiu-jitsu athlete that was way more popular when the lapel guards were in style, right? With Keenan Cornelius, we saw people dedicating the whole year to the gi. But now no-gi being so popular, no-gi being a real avenue for athletes to make money, I think there's this idea that your gi jiu-jitsu should at least closely resemble or at least be easier to transition out of when it is no gi season. And I think depending on the lapel kind of pulls you one step further away from that goal. So I think we're starting to see maybe a lot more K guard without the lapel, right? Because squid is just K guard with the lapel. And that way, when you're transitioning from uh, gi season to no gi season, it's still, familiar to you. You don't have to relearn or unlearn certain skills. But I think the other thing too, and we see this with jujitsu a lot, is when people become hyper aware and start strategizing against a trend or against whatever the meta is at the time. We see those particular techniques or systems kind of fall out of popularity. So I think with the lapel guards, what you see is yes, the lapel is part of the upper body garb, but all of the lapel guards are primarily lower body guards. And so I think when passers started to realize, well, as long as I keep my legs back, lapel guards don't exist. We started to see lapel guards kind of go extinct because people weren't presenting their legs as much. So think of like Keenan and Leandro Lowe. Leandro Lowe only passes with his legs forward, or primarily, right? He likes to give up De La Hiva, go for that knee cut. He does have Toriandos, but it's very rarely that he'll engage with only his upper body. And so I think people studying Keenan and understanding more conceptually that the lapel guards require the legs to immobilize the passer. People became keen and started only leading heavy with the upper body. And therefore, we saw a slight maybe like removal of the lapel systems, but we saw an introduction of the collar sleeve with like Tommy Langacker and Nicholas Marigali. We saw things like Spider Lasso come back in style. So, like all things in jiu-jitsu, they're very cyclical and they're very dependent on what the meta strategy is and what positions are being played. And so I think naturally, as people feel more comfortable to bring their legs back in, so as people focus more on upper body guards and forget to be as good at the lower body guards, we'll see a reintroduction of the lapels, I'm pretty sure. But as long as Nogi is very strong in the scene as terms of like, an avenue for athletes to make money, I think it's one of those things that will just kind of reemerge with people who are predominantly gi playing. But yeah, we could expect to see it come back as people start leading with the legs again.
Interesting. So I've heard you mention a few words in other conversations before, and I'm just curious where you are coming from here. You've mentioned things like structure and alignment in terms of like your teaching and concepts. Can you define those in terms of what you perceive those things, and where did that sort of mindset come from?
Yeah, so I think it's once you understand that when you're trying to develop your jujitsu and you're trying to get quote unquote good at jujitsu, what you're trying to do is discover stable patterns that emerge from interactions in jiu-jitsu and less so on specific techniques. Then it allows you to kind of strip at least the instruction down to what's really important. So the things in jiu-jitsu that don't change from one position to the next. And that's goes back to the structure question that you pose as well, which is, well, which one is actually the structured teaching style? Is it the one where you prescribe an Americana or you prescribe a Gogoplata and you prescribe these techniques, these moves, or is it the one where students learn how to use these concepts that emerge in every single situation in jiu-jitsu? So structure is going to come down to a couple of components, right? First, it comes in the form of frames. At Movement Art, we always focus on frames because I think it's important that students learn how not to lose before they learn how to learn. So every guard is broken down into hooks and frames, and every guard is just a different ratio and combination of hooks and frames. For example, butterfly guard is an example of when you're all hooks. You're double hooking the legs and you're underhooking and hooking the arm. So all of your limbs are hooking your opponent. And then you have guards, like maybe when you're playing double lassos or you're just framing and guard retention, where you're all frames. And that's a very defensive structure because instead of creating situations where you can latch onto your opponent to get in, you're just putting up structures that maintain distance between you and them, and that doesn't allow them to close that range and close the gap on you. So I think when students are starting out at movement art, we try to prioritize the frames, having the student understand how to maintain distance, how to keep themselves safe, how to prevent the opponent from grabbing their head, getting chest on chest. These are the skills that we think are more important in the beginning because as they understand how to not lose as much, now they have more time to participate in the winning. When students only know how to use hooks in the beginning, what ends up happening is they have an over reliance and dependence on escapes. And this is why you see, people with it's almost like a misconception of this idea that fundamentals are escapes, like learning how to escape side control and mount and back mount, which are all important, right? I do not want to discredit those skills. You do need to know how to escape these bad positions, but I think it's more important to look at why are students ending up in these bad positions so often. I have students who are blue belts who rarely get their guards passed because they understand how to use frames. So we took the liberty of setting our students up for the aspect of jiu-jitsu that allows them to survive longer so that they can now start to explore how to win the game. So structure, frames, right? You can also look at the structure of your body. Why do you get stacked in certain situations? Well, if your spine is a ball, well, you're going to get rolled up when someone applies pressure to the end of your lever. Say your legs are up, right? They can just push your ankles, and that's going to lift your back off the floor. So then we introduce the idea of structuring your spine so they can't access your body in a way where it rolls up on itself. So structure is very important because it's conceptual and we can see how these patterns emerge consistently in jiu-jitsu. They're not just ideas, right? They're not abstracted techniques that work, in very specific moments. They're things that you're going to be applying everywhere almost all the time. And so this is for us, this is what the fundamentals are of jiu-jitsu, right? It's these concepts, you can call them. And when you look at the movement art curriculum for white belts, a lot of what they need to know is just how jiu-jitsu can be organized in this way.
Now, is that curriculum something that you give to the white belts to
Yes.
read or wow,
Yeah, we
wow.
have curriculums, and we actually just had a curriculum day this past Friday because we have a promotion ceremony coming up. And so, one thing we like to do is leading up to belt promotions, we'll have a curriculum day. Students come in for like an hour and a half. Students are just going through, making sure they understand the concepts that we're talking about and that we're expecting from them. And the whole time, me, Danny, and a couple of other instructors are just walking around and getting to everybody and making sure everybody understands what's on there. Because, like I said, for us, it's imperative that they understand the fundamentals of jiu-jitsu before they can start really conceptualizing what jiu-jitsu means for them and what kind of jiu-jitsu they're going to be building thereafter. And some people might say, well, that's just your idea of jiu-jitsu. That's just your opinion, man. But there is something to be said when black belts come from other gyms. And I could be explaining a very simple concept like how to frame, right? If you want the full maximization and optimization of your frames, you want to use as many limbs as possible. So that's maximizing your frames. And you want to optimize your frames by making sure that your bones are stacked on top of each other, right? So if there's a slight kink in your arm, well, guess what? It's going to be a lot easier for someone to collapse your frame. But if you practice locking out your frame, now you're stacking your bones behind one another. And you'll be surprised how many black belts come in. They're like, I've never thought about it like that. I was never taught how to frame like this. And for us, that's not something that we want our students to come to the realization of. We want them to have these skills and these concepts as early on as possible.
I'm very interested in how you're teaching the teachers, so to speak.
So first, so we have one of our students, Shane. He's a brown belt, and he is now going to start teaching his own fundamental classes. But leading up to this, right, one of the things they can do is assist us in teaching the kids class. Because what I like to say is fundamentals for adults is what kids class are to kids. Because we teach kids as if they're adults. I don't water down jujitsu for the kids. In fact, kids sometimes learn faster and they're more receptive to information or receptive to how to think about jujitsu in a way that's creative, more so than adults who come in, like you said, with these very ideological and dogmatic ways of perceiving a learning environment. So they'll assist us and they'll see like and of course they have their own experience from taking our classes, but I think it's different when they see it not from a egocentric view, but they have almost this allocentric view. They see it from a third person, like how the class is being coordinated. And they're like, okay, this is how you can run a practice. This is how these things look like from a instructor's point of view. Because it's one thing when you're going into class with your thinking cap on and you're trying to learn and you're trying to level up. And it's another thing when you're assisting in that production. You're in the apparatus that is giving the environment and space to the students. So they learn how to create that. They learn how to facilitate a class like that. And so I think that's imperative that they do maybe assist us, almost like an apprenticeship. And of course, whatever else they learn from taking our classes, as well as just, I'm always talking to my instructors, right? We text each other before they teach a class. They get my insight, they get Danny's insight on what they're about to teach. Dialogue is huge. Like, we have to be talking to one another. We have to keep communication open because that's the foundation of the jiu-jitsu that we're teaching. It is this open dialogue. So if there's not open dialogue between instructors, how can we expect that between students, right?
So you're providing feedback to your instructors and perhaps on the side or something after a class
Yeah,
saying,
and
"Hey, maybe a little
it's
this, a little more of that, a little less of this."
exactly. And
Mm.
I'm never going to prescribe to them like you need to do it like me, because I do want them to create what it is that they envision movement art jiu-jitsu to be, but it's based on the norms, like I said. So what are the norms? Well, I think maybe here you were describing the thing a little bit too long. Maybe shorten the description. Maybe is there even a need to describe the thing, or could that be brought to awareness through maybe posing a problem, or maybe you can prompt it with a problem like, hey, like if this happens, how would you solve it? Because everyone's going to have interventions they're more comfortable in using. And you'll see this with instructors. If they're kind of desperate to just get the information across to students, they'll always resort back to interventions that they're comfortable with, which is for most instructors just show and tell. Just here, do this, right? And part of it is just getting our instructors to think more critically about how they're teaching. Not to say that that's wrong, but was that needed, or was there another way that maybe you could have gotten that information across? I think it's more how I try to go about it. I'm never like prescribing like, hey, I would have taught it like this, right? Because again, that would be inserting like an ideal version of that technique that I do, and that would be inserting that I think my jujitsu is the ideal jujitsu, which is not. That's not the culture at Movement Art, right?
Now, Nick, can you give me, and I'm sure you got a million of these, particular an aha moment?
I'll give you two, and they both have to do with Mikey.
Okay, yeah.
Because Mikey's been a big mentor of ours, not just through the jiu-jitsu, because I think there is a lot to be said about how he does jiu-jitsu, and I try to mimic a lot of that, not for the sake of being like Mikey, but sometimes I like to put myself in his shoes and ask myself, like, how did he come up with this? And maybe there's something to be learned from that if I try to follow his footsteps, right? But one thing me and Danny learned right away when we visited Mikey in Las Vegas was that he trains with hobbyists, right? He trains with, like, if you look at his team that he trains with on a daily basis, they're lawyers, doctors, there's a gymnast in there, there's it's just regular people who don't compete, who don't train full time. And so the first thing I learned was like, wow, there's a way to train jujitsu. And this is coming from the Marcelo Garcia approach, where I thought you have to be surrounded with world champions if you wanted to be a world champion, which is the way that we're taught, right? That's the way we're socialized. And here we see Mikey, the GOAT, probably one of the best jujitsu practitioners on the planet right now, at least the most technical, and he's training with people who are way below his level. And so a lot of that aha moment was like, how does he do this? And if he can do it, then we should be able to do that with our students at our gym and get to the level that we want to get to without necessarily thinking that we have to be surrounded by monsters and other world-class competitors. So seeing how he trains with them, and just to give you, because that's a whole podcast on its own, right? Like how he trains with his training partners. But one thing I noticed is that he will wait for responses, right? For example, if I have a student that I know that I could just grab their legs, throw their legs, grab side control, and submit them right away, right? I can do that. But one, I'm not going to be getting any better
Right.
because I'm taking so many turns that I'm not even allowing jujitsu to take place. And then two, they're not getting anything out of it. So what I really admire is that Mikey can roll with someone that he could just insta kill, but he allows jujitsu to happen.
Right.
Right. It's almost like a language. It's like he allows, instead of just like getting the first word in and then finishing the conversation, he allows an exchange of word, like dialogue, which is what jujitsu sometimes comes down to when you're teaching the way that we teach, but now just doing it through your body and having dialogue with students who maybe are lower in skill than you. So seeing that and going back to the gym and rolling with my students. And so, like, if a situation comes up where I do feel like I could finish it right away, I pause and I allow them to react because they're reacting slow. It's not that they don't know the answer; it's just it's taking them a little bit longer to understand what's happening, right?
Yeah,
To
sure.
attune to the problem. So
Right.
I'll wait. I'll let them solve the problem. Sometimes they solved it in a way that's not gonna stop me from doing what I want to do, but I allow that to happen anyways. And you'll be surprised how doing that sometimes puts me in situations that I've never even seen before. I'm like, oh, okay. So now I'm rolling with this blue belt and I'm actually getting a lot out of it because I'm learning new things as well. And they're able to respond to the things I'm doing. So that's an aha moment because leading up to that, I thought training was just bump heads, tap someone who's worse than you as many times as possible. And that's how you get better at jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
Apparently it's not. And
Yeah,
then the other thing
that's
is
great.
Mikey, every time we train with him, every time he competes, maybe you've noticed this, he's a completely different grappler. I mean, he still has the same style of being. That's who Mikey is. It's always going
Mhm.
to be this, dilemma of can I leg lock them? Can I take the back? Can I come top and pass really tight? So that's his style of being, right? That's the language he speaks in jiu-jitsu. He's never going to come out there and play deep half guard or play like these positions that are way outside of his wheelhouse. But if you pay attention, it's always slightly different. There's always a different way in which he's framing, a different way in which he's controlling the leg. And for me, that's amazing because if you have this dogmatic way of looking at jiu-jitsu where we're always trying to idealize what we do and thinking that there's this perfect form, right? Almost like very like platonic idea of jiu-jitsu. Like there's this thing that we're trying to achieve. And once we achieve it, we have perfect jiu-jitsu. But instead, Mikey's like, no, there's so many ways we can do these things. So the fun is in figuring out all the different ways, not necessarily in figuring out the best way, because they're all going to work on different body types in different situations. So for him, it's he's always trying to learn different ways of accomplishing the same goal, which is tap your opponent, right? Or to take their back. So for me, it's like this gives credibility maybe to what we're doing, which is if we're not teaching specific techniques because we think that that's how the technique should be done, then maybe by Mikey doing this, that's how we should be looking at training jiu-jitsu. And that, of course, informs drastically how we teach and how we look at jiu-jitsu. So those are like the two main aha moments, I would say. And they both came from Mikey, of course, the person who gave us our black belt. But it just comes to show that a lot of ways, like presuppositions we had about jujitsu are maybe incorrect. And I love that about being around Mikey, that he challenges the way I had thought about jujitsu in a way where it shatters norms. It
Mhm.
shatters the idea that you need to be at Atos or AOJ to become a world champion. It shatters the idea that you can just learn a sweep, and the idea of being better at jiu-jitsu is just keep working on that sweep over and over again until you perfect it, right? And that's what jiu-jitsu is. It's you should be shattering your previous ideas of what's possible. And if you're not doing that, then you're not in the right space.
Yeah, it's great to hear that kind of validates, the old Roger Gracie story too when he moved to London, right, where he didn't have any
Hmm.
training partners and besides Braulio, who was far away at the time.
Yeah, and you see it with I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone, but at least what I noticed, JT Torres won both of his ADCC titles
Yeah,
after he opened up Essential. Lucas Lepre, I'm pretty sure, accomplished a bunch of his goals after he opened up his alliance school, the Mendez brothers. So I think this is something that has always been around us, but
agreed.
it
Agreed.
took Mikey to make me realize like what was really happening.
All right. Now, I'm curious about your belting criteria at each level. What are you looking for? What are you thinking about?
So from white belt to blue belt, it's pretty straightforward. Show us that you understand how to not lose, how to structure yourself, what the heuristics in certain positions are. So obviously, if you're outside passing, you're trying to flank the person. If you're inside passing, like what is your goal when you're inside passing? What is your goal? Like there should be obvious understandings of what you're trying to accomplish in any given position in jiu-jitsu, right? Or any given situation. So that's the first thing. It's almost like a level of competency, I guess you could say, is what we're looking for. And the same goes for blue belt, maybe a little bit more nuanced. So maybe you should be able to show a diversity of these strategies. So if you understand when the person's leading with an upper body position, and you understand that when they lead with the upper body, you have to play on the upper body. Do you have multiple ways of going about that, right? Or are you just a one trick pony, right? So we want to see that development going and continuing further. But at a certain point, so for us, it's at brown belt. I try to look at it as like, okay, now you're at the PhD level, right? And for those who don't know, when you go for your PhD, what happens is if you're given an advisor and you co-create your curriculum for your PhD with that advisor. So at that point, when you're about to be an expert in your field, you are now in charge of your learning and creating your specialty. And that's how we see jujitsu. At brown belt, it's our goal to have given you the skills to create your own knowledge. Now at brown belt, it's time to create your own knowledge. It's time to create your own style of being. It's time to figure out who you want to be as a jiu-jitsu practitioner, the same way a PhD student would have to create their own curriculum, write a dissertation paper, right? And defend their paper, their thesis. And for us, that completes the whole transformation. And that's when we would consider someone to be a black belt, when they're able to do those things.
Can you tell me, has there ever been a time you considered quitting and why?
Oh, yeah, many times. It used to be a lot more. Now that I'm teaching and I'm more passionate about teaching, it doesn't happen anymore because my satisfaction and what makes me happy comes from seeing my students achieve their goals and seeing them succeed on the mat. But I mean, before teaching, like every day I would travel to Marcelo's and I would get demoralized, right, by Mateus Denise, or, I would get submitted like every single way you can imagine. I would want to quit. I'd be like, I majored in bio, right? My concentration is molecular cell physiology. I had um, a job lined up that I could have taken. And
The IVF stuff, right? I mean, you could have
yeah,
crushed it.
yeah,
What
yeah,
are you in
yeah.
this
I
game?
had this whole
You could have had a boat by now.
I
Jeez.
had it all figured out. I had a whole strategy for how I was going to go about my life. And I completely popped that bubble to now be a brown belt in Manhattan, just getting smashed
Right? Sleeping in a
and
closet. Yeah, totally.
sleeping in a closet. Yeah. People telling me, like, what are you doing, dude? And especially my parents being immigrants from Brazil. One of the funniest things is my parents moved from Brazil with nothing but, as my dad says, like $15 to his name.
Wow.
They learned the language.
Yep.
My mom was pregnant with me like the first year they moved here. They had me and they had all these ideas, right, of who their son was going to be. Oh, our son's going to be a doctor. He's going to be
Yeah,
this. And what does their son do? Their
that
son
close.
teaches jiu-jitsu. They could have just stayed in Brazil. They
Jeez.
jinxed themselves.
That's
Yeah, but
fantastic.
but honestly, like everything I've been through, including undergrad, including my experiences in a lab. I'm actually in grad school right now. I'm getting my master's in bioethics. So even today,
Wow. Good
yeah.
for
So
you, man.
even
That's
to
awesome.
this day, I try to lead by example, and I hope that example is, when you're a student, you're forever curious, and it's kind of funny because the podcast is like forever a white belt, right?
Yes, that it's the hat tip to that. Yes.
Yeah, and that's what I try to embody, and that's, I guess, ultimately what it boils down to is you want your students to always stay curious. And how do you keep that curiosity alive is you have to create an environment that allows them to be curious. And the moment you constrain that and you put out that fire, that's when people get bored, they plateau,
Yeah,
they
it's the
lose
worst
their
thing in the world.
passion.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I had
It's
to
a
find
loss.
that
It's
out
such a
for
loss.
myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. But hopefully, at least at Movement Art, no one has to go through that because we really try really hard to make sure it doesn't happen through the environment, through how we teach. And yeah, so far, so good.
A lot of us know pretty much who's on the Mount Rushmore of jujitsu, right? Or we have our general names, maybe those top 10 keep popping up. Who are sort of like the underrated, like greats in your mind, whether it's, current or historical, that you just haven't heard getting a lot of love?
I would say probably Dan Colville. He's a black belt I trained with at Marcelo's. I think he's disgustingly underrated. Like,
Mm,
when people think of close guard, they think of Hodger. When people think of like good jiu-jitsu, they think of all the greats who have competed at the highest level. And it's a shame that some of these practitioners who don't ever really break through the scene, and they're kind of like hidden away in their own labs, tucked away in Jersey or these, random places across the globe. They don't get the credit they deserve because, jiu-jitsu, of course, we're always looking up to the competitors and whoever Flow Grappling shines a light on. But Dan Colville is literally one of the brightest and most technical jiu-jitsu players that I've ever come across. I mean, you have Paul Schreiner, who took me under his wing at Marcelo Garcia, who
Incredible. Yeah.
who
Structure
was
too.
yeah, literally like things that we see right now that are in the meta. Like everyone talks about Joseph Chen's tripod passing, butterfly guard passing. Paul Schreiner was doing this like 7 years ago, at least like that I saw, probably even before that. So, and that's another situation where people have no idea because they only see what's being shown to them. So, there's just so many people that I've come across that just really, at least for me, changed the way I think about jujitsu. And I know anyone who comes across them, they also have that same impact on them, but no one knows that. So, they're almost like your jiu-jitsu coach's favorite coach, right? It's
Totally.
almost like an unspoken thing. And then you have guys like Jason Rao, who I think, is a phenomenal coach
Yeah.
and phenomenal instructor. I watch his stuff and I'm like,
Incredible.
yeah, he gets it. Like he understands jiu-jitsu. So yeah, I mean, and again, he's not I think he's getting a little bit more popular now, but for a
Yeah.
while, like no one would even
I
if you
know.
said Jason Rao, no one would even recognize that name.
Yeah.
So
Talk about later in his career. It's
yeah,
amazing to see that
yeah.
happen and fantastic. Good for him.
So those are like 3 names I think I can think of right now. And then of course, like, do I even have to say Mikey, Danny? Like these are guys that, that inspire me every day. And, I think their work speaks for itself, like what they've done and what they've shown. So many people to name.
Yeah. Now I'm curious about your early on in your training or your development too. Did you kind of come out as like an offensive player or were you more of like this counterpunching type that had to sort of adapt?
No, I mean, I wrestled in middle school. I wrestled most of high school. I got my blue belt from my MMA coach. I trained at an MMA gym. The idea was like you go, you get after it. If you lose, it's because you were too slow, you weren't strong enough, your cardio sucks. So that was my idea of jiu-jitsu was it was this purely physical and aggressive endeavor. And so if you look at my highlights as a blue belt, I've never pulled guard. I would be one of those guys that's like, pulling guards is for pussies or whatever. Like, we don't do that. We go for the takedown or we get taken down. And, you know, so I almost like resonate with that because I understand where that mindset comes from. But through my experiences of training with so many different people and training at so many gyms, you start to realize that first, is this a sustainable practice? Am I going to be doing this when I'm 50 years old? Am I really going to be going for blast doubles and suplexes? And then
Great,
the
great
other
point.
thing is like, is there a way to train jujitsu that is more organized? And that for me was more of a long-term development, but I can remember little kernels here and there, little developments here and there, as a blue belt, as a purple belt, that slowly culminated into the ideas that we see now that we preach at Movement Art. For example, when I went to, it was me and he's a black belt. He owns Heritage Jiu Jitsu now, Marcus Johnson, a JT
Hmm.
Torres black belt, one of my best friends. We went over to Camp Springs, trained with the whole, Metal Chasers team. And I remember rolling, he fell off the face of the earth. Jordan Schultz. Okay. Before rolling with Jordan Schultz, my idea of guard playing was completely different. I thought, you play
Wow.
the butterfly guards, the single leg X, just like my coach, Kurt Pellegrino, was doing, just like his coach, Marcelo Garcia, was doing. But when I rolled with Jordan Schultz, I tried to pass his guard and I immediately felt like I was running into walls. And I didn't even know what he was playing at the time. But I remember going back home completely demoralized and trying to recreate the things that I thought were happening. And little did I know that I was recreating collar sleeve. I was recreating collar sleeve with the De La Hiva. And then I was watching Hoffa and adding the whole De La Hiva aspect on top of that. But now I can watch Jordan Schultz in his old matches and be like, oh my God, that's what he was doing to me. And so that
Wow.
exposure allowed me to think of jujitsu in a way that made a little bit more sense. Like, of course, if I'm framing the shoulders, they can't just dive in with their shoulders. And it seems so obvious and it seems like common sense when you look at it after the fact. But until you're exposed to the possibility, you don't have the exposure. You can't conceive of it. And that's why it's so important that you have an environment where students can be exposed to so many varieties and diversities of jiu-jitsu playing, because there's so much that they need to be exposed to for them to actually develop a sense of self and develop their jiu-jitsu. There's no way they can develop their jiu-jitsu as long as they're being constrained to what their instructor is telling them. At the very least, it won't be their jiu-jitsu, it'll just be a shadow or a shell of their coach's jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, that's such a challenge too. Like, I mean, when you get students that are coming 1 to 2 days a week, how are you overcoming that challenge?
So maximizing the time on the mat, right? So as long as the practices are good, a really good practice can be worth a whole week of training if this other person's whole week of training is inefficient, right? So for example, if you're going to a gym where the coach is talking for 50% of the class and you're only rolling once or twice, maybe three times, how much better are you actually getting, even if you train 5 days a week in comparison to someone maybe in my classes, they train, let's say, twice a week. I'm maybe talking, let's say, 20% of the time. And the talking is problem posed and dialogical. So they're like, people are asking questions, I'm answering questions, I'm having them think about jiu-jitsu for themselves. And then on top of that, they're positionally sparring within the class time. And then we have a whole hour of sparring after the fact that 99% of our students partake in. So I would say twice a week of that is worth a lot more than the week of whatever else they could be doing. And so I think it really comes down to the coach facilitating a practice that is efficient and that really makes every second count so the student can get the most bang for their buck. And then on top of that, of course, the training doesn't start and end in the class. As long as the student is still exposing themselves to jiu-jitsu off the mat, so they're, whether it's watching matches or watching instructionals, right? The idea is that as long as they're doing that, they're still attuning their perception of jiu-jitsu. They're still being exposed to all the possibilities that jiu-jitsu allows them to do. Until they see that, they don't know it exists. And that ties into what we were talking about previously. If they're watching jiu-jitsu on top of those two really dense classes, I would say that's almost way better than the alternative, in my opinion.
So I'd be remiss if I don't ask you about your thoughts on the eco CLA movement. And I've heard you mention before mini games versus constraint led games. I'm thinking they're totally different the way that you're speaking about them. But can you touch on just that whole spectrum?
Yeah, so what Greg Souders has done in jiu-jitsu is amazing. He's literally consciously or unconsciously is dispelling the idea of what I call Cartesian jiu-jitsu, the idea that, the mind and body is split. And this is how Western education and Western philosophy, and even society thinks about themselves. They think that they're like a mini self inside of their brain and that their body is just an instrument that their mind controls. So by Greg Satter's injecting the idea of ecological approach and constraints-led approach as methodologies that we can use to design practices, he's basically dispelling the idea of Cartesian jiu-jitsu, even though people don't think about it philosophically, right? So the idea that embodying jiu-jitsu and experiencing jiu-jitsu precedes the abstract knowledge that your coach can give you, I think is at the heart of what this new movement is. Now, whether or not the best way to go about that is CLA or mini games, right? I think honestly, I don't think we're ever going to have the answer to this, because I think it should be open for instructors to experiment and find out what works in a class setting, because what works for an individual student is going to literally be different student to student. So I think as coaches, it's about facilitating practices that benefit everyone, which is a lot more challenging than a lot of people would think, because in a private lesson I can really get to know a student and understand how they best learn. And so every private lesson is literally different, but in a class setting, how do we best level up everyone's skill in jiu-jitsu? I do like how CLA is focusing on the embodiment of skill. How do we develop skill in jiu-jitsu? Well, we need to be doing jiu-jitsu. So less talking about the abstract, because we understand that jiu-jitsu doesn't exist in the abstract. It doesn't exist in the idealized form. It exists in the movement solutions we discover as we train. So more focus on that is good. Now, on the other hand, we have to be careful with reducing jujitsu down only to the movement solutions, right? Because when I think about jujitsu, I think of like, how can my students maybe one day impart their knowledge, impart their philosophy of jujitsu and developing skills. So I do like complementing the CLA approach with more of a Freirean, like pedagogical approach, which is like I was talking about, like dialogue, talk to the students, have them co-create their knowledge with you so they can see where you're coming from, you can see where they're coming from, they can explore how to problem solve together. So I think sometimes gyms that only do the CLA thinking that that's going to solve the problem are missing the camaraderie and the collective good of the dialogue that can exist on top of CLA. And that's why I think that focusing on the democratic environment where CLA can exist is more important rather than just not thinking about the environment and just injecting the environment with new ways of designing practice. I think sometimes you have to be aware of how you're doing that because sometimes those things can be contradictory. But for sure, I think that in the future, everyone's going to be looking at jujitsu phenomenologically, right? Like everyone's going to be looking at jujitsu through embodied cognition because any person who actually stops to think about it, they don't deny that that's how we learn, right? So when I ask you, define temperature to me, we can't forget that the reason thermodynamics exists and why the measurements of temperature exist in the first place is because at some point someone experienced cold and hot. So even our scientific abstractions start with experience. And so we need to stay true to this. We can never forget where the abstractions come from because unfortunately, jiu-jitsu has come to the point where we've been so far removed to how jiu-jitsu was created that we just teach the final result. We just teach the abstractions, thinking that that's going to shortcut the student's journey, forgetting that the whole point of jiu-jitsu is being able to create jiu-jitsu for ourselves so we can understand how jiu-jitsu forms. So we need our students to feel hot and cold first before they can understand that the boiling point of water is at this altitude, right? Because that isn't situated. That is good for a calculation. It's good for a model of understanding things, but that's not reality. And that's not the reality jiu-jitsu operates in. So I think this is what Greg Souders has done by introducing the conversation of the ecological approach. But I would like to push the conversation further and say, well, how about the meta space around the practice? How does that space work in favor of your practice design? How are you creating an environment that's conducive to CLA or to all the other approaches that you can use, right? And so I think this is where the conversation needs to go next. But without a doubt, I think in the next 20 years, everyone's going to look back at the traditional model, the information processing model, as being archaic because I know I did. You know, Greg Satters did open up my mind to a lot of things that maybe we can do better when it comes to the embodiment of jiu-jitsu. I think, positional sparring is not the same as constraints-led approach, right? There are ways for us to have these movement solutions emerge that are more effective. So I'm not going to lie and be like, oh yeah, I was doing this the whole time just because I was doing positional sparring. So a lot of it is a little bit of humility as well as coaches. We need to admit when we're wrong and admit when we are learning and that we're not perfect. Because when our students see that they see that we're being honest with them, when I go from, actually the CLA stuff is legit, they can resonate with that because they're like, he just wants what's best for us and he's willing to admit fault and he's willing to evolve to give us the best knowledge and the best information that he can provide us. So I would say for the people that are kind of like on the fence, I think they need to just understand like your students will be okay with you experimenting because for them, that's going to bring you down to their level and they want to see you as a coach also developing your jiu-jitsu because that shows them that jiu-jitsu is this thing that we can always develop and we can always get better at. There is
Mhm.
no ceiling, so to speak.
Yeah, I do want to talk about your online offerings, and I was so interested to hear about movement art online, your YouTube stuff, your Fanatic offerings.
Yeah, so obviously the BJJ Fanatic courses are going to be an inside look of what our games look like, right? So when we teach a course on the Berimbolo, these are all of our findings, right? These are the things that we've discovered for ourselves when problem solving and troubleshooting the bear bull. And of course, a lot of it is maybe things that Mikey has told us, other things that we've learned along the way. But I think it's important for people to understand how to use instructionals and to use it this way. Even the movement art online, this is something that we say in our courses. Use this course as a template or a guide to attune your understanding of jiu-jitsu and to see what's possible. Don't try to replicate what we're doing because you're not me. What makes Nick Nick is 30 years of experiences and traumas and preferences and memories, and you're never going to be able to get all of that. So go into a course being taught by someone in the sense that you're just trying to understand how they see jujitsu and have that inform how you can see jujitsu. So it would be like reading a book, right? Like when I read a book, my goal isn't to plagiarize that book and try to get it published. That one, that's just full out illegal, but two, that's also academically dishonest. When I read a book, I'm looking to gain inspiration and maybe learn something that can inform a later project, right? And this is, what I experienced in school as well when we read a textbook, right? And then we write a paper. I'm not copy and pasting what I read. I'm trying to form my own thoughts based on what I read. So I think movement online is gonna completely change people's games and how they see jujitsu as long as they use it correctly. So my biggest advice for those who are going to go on Movement Art Online and maybe try a month out and they're going to maybe see an overwhelming amount of information, they're going to see sparring footage, just use it as a tool to guide your learning. So if you're, every time we're showing a position, we're going to give context, and that context is what allowed us to discover that solution. But don't lose sight of the context. That's the most important part. And then play around with the ideas. That's how I would like people to kind of approach movement art online if they can.
Wow. And then your YouTube stuff?
Yeah, so we have a YouTube. So we've been focusing on the website recently. So we've been kind of inactive on YouTube, but we're going to be active on there. The goal is to also cross promote. So we're going to be posting a lot of the techniques, videos, games, sparring footage that's on the online website as well on our YouTube to also promote the site and show people what it's about. Our Instagram is at Movement Art Jiu-Jitsu. On there, you can kind of get a look at what movement art is like, what the culture is like. We have student showcase or spotlights, I think we call them, where students talk about their experiences in the gym. We post techniques. You can go on my page at that Nick Salles. I'm constantly posting stuff on there, techniques, sparring footage. Sometimes I drop a picture with a philosophical caption on there if you care for that sort of thing. But yeah, most importantly, I'm 100% always open and available on my social media. And this is one thing I try to say at every seminar and podcast when I get the chance is if you're going to follow me because you want to talk to me and learn from me. I am not trying to be just an icon on your screen. I want to be accessible to people. So feel free to send me messages, questions about training, learning, techniques, and I'll 100% get back to you.
Nick, was there anything that I missed that you wanted to cover or discuss or anything?
No, and hopefully, this is not the last time we do one of these. Maybe
No way.
the viewers can let us know if they want me back on sometime in the near future. And like I said, there's a million things we can talk about. I feel like we're just scratching the surface. So, hopefully we can revisit a lot of these topics and more on the next one if people are interested.
Nick, I had absolute blast talking to you. Like you mentioned there, I could talk to you all day. I could feel we could just go on and on. An hour and
Yeah,
a half
dude.
went in
We're
a
just
blink of an
vibing, bro.
eye, and we're just touched the tip of the iceberg. This was
Yeah,
fantastic. We have to do a part 2 and a part
please.
3 and a part 4 eventually too.
Yes. Oh,
So,
yes. Let's do it.
Nick, thanks so much for your time, brother.
Thank you, bro.
All right, everyone. I'm your host, Adolfo Ferranda. Thanks again. Go train at North Bay Jiu-Jitsu. Drink your salt electrolytes. Check out our swag at fwb.printful.me. You'll probably see all links all over the place here. All the links and everything that Nick mentioned will be in the show notes. Nick, again, thanks so much for your time, man. That was awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, I had so much fun, man.
All right, you guys. See you next time.